I want you to picture something for me. You're sitting in a lawyer's office in a strip mall outside Sacramento, and your own son is sliding a folder across the table toward you, and inside that folder is a document that would let him make decisions about your money, your medical care, your house, without asking you first. He's not doing it out of malice. He'll tell you that. He'll tell you it's just in case, just for peace of mind, just something responsible families do. But what you're hearing, sitting there in that vinyl chair with a pen in your hand, is something else entirely. What you're hearing is, we've already decided you're going to need managing. My name is Walter. I'm 74 years old, and about 14 months ago, my son Brian got a court to grant him power of attorney over my affairs. And 3 weeks after that happened, I got on a plane with one suitcase and a duffel bag, and I flew to Manila, and I have not looked back. Before you decide whether I'm the villain of this story or not, stick around, because it's a lot more complicated than it sounds, and if stories like this are the kind of thing you want more of, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because I've got a lot more to say, and I think you're going to want to hear where this one ends up. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand how I got to that lawyer's office in the first place. I spent 38 years as a machinist and then a shop floor supervisor for a manufacturing company outside Sacramento that made components for agricultural equipment. Tractors, combines, that kind of thing. It was steady, unglamorous work, and I was good at it. My wife Donna was a hairdresser, ran her own little salon out of a strip mall for almost 30 years before her hands started giving her trouble, and she had to stop. We raised 2 kids, Brian and my daughter Kelly, in a house we bought in 1979 for something like $42,000, a number that sounds like a joke now given what that same house is worth today. Donna passed away 4 years ago. Stroke, sudden, no warning, gone in about 6 hours from the time it happened to the time the doctors told me there was nothing left to do. We'd been married 49 years. 1 year short of 50, which is a detail that used to make me furious in a way I couldn't fully explain, like the universe had cheated us out of a round number. After Donna died, I did what I think a lot of men my age do, which is nothing much at all. I kept the house exactly as it was. I mowed the lawn on the same schedule. I went to the same diner on Wednesdays, where the waitress, a woman named Carol who'd been serving me coffee for 15 years, would just bring me the same order without asking any more. I watched a lot of television. I fixed things around the house that didn't really need fixing. I was, by any honest measure, drifting. Not depressed exactly, or at least I never called it that, but hollowed out, going through a set of motions that used to belong to 2 people and now only had to carry the weight of one, and somehow felt heavier for it. Brian lives about 40 minutes away with his wife and 2 kids. He's a good son in a lot of ways. He calls, he shows up. He's the kind of person who reads articles about elder fraud scams and forwards them to me with subject lines like, "Dad, please be careful." He started coming around more after Donna died, which I appreciated at first. Sunday dinners, help with the yard, checking in on my finances, which I understood, because I'd started forgetting a payment or two, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary fog of a man in his 70s living alone and not paying quite as close attention as he used to. But somewhere in there, the checking in turned into something else. It turned into a kind of quiet audit that never really stopped. It started small. Brian noticed I'd made a donation to a veterans charity he didn't recognize, and instead of just asking me about it over dinner like a normal conversation, he called the charity directly to verify it was legitimate. I found out about that months later almost by accident when someone from the charity mentioned it in a follow-up letter. Then he started asking to see my bank statements, just to help me budget, he said. And I let him, because what was the harm? He was my son. He loved me. Then he started showing up unannounced on weekday afternoons, ostensibly to fix something, but I began to notice he'd linger in the kitchen where the mail was stacked, flipping through envelopes he had no business flipping through. I brought it up once, gently, over dinner. I said, "Brian, I appreciate you looking out for me, but I feel like you're checking up on me more than visiting me. and he got very quiet and very careful, the way people get when they've rehearsed a response, and he said, "Dad, I'm worried about you. You're alone in that house. Mom used to handle a lot of the day-to-day stuff, and I don't think you realize how much you're struggling without her." I told him I wasn't struggling. He said that's exactly what someone who was struggling would say. I didn't have a good answer for that, and looking back, I think that's the moment I should have pushed back harder, because it set the tone for everything that came after. From that point on, anything I said in my own defense got quietly reinterpreted as evidence of the problem. About 8 months after Donna died, I did something that, in hindsight, gave Brian exactly the ammunition he was looking for. I met a woman. Her name was Susan, a widow herself. We'd met at a grief support group I'd started attending mostly because Carol at the diner had suggested it, half as a joke, half not. Susan and I got along. We had coffee. We went to a couple of movies. It was nothing serious, nothing that involved money or living arrangements or any of the things that usually set off alarm bells in these situations, but Brian found out about it before I got around to telling him myself, and he reacted like I'd announced I was joining a cult. He sat me down and asked how well I really knew this woman, whether I'd checked her background, whether I understood that elderly widowers were, quote, a prime target for people looking to take advantage. I told him Susan didn't want anything from me except company on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't believe me. Or maybe he did believe me, and it didn't matter, because by then, the story he'd built in his head about his fragile, vulnerable, declining father had a momentum all its own, and Susan just happened to be the next piece of evidence that fit the narrative he'd already decided on. Around the 1-year mark after Donna's death, I had a minor fall in the bathroom. Slipped getting out of the shower, bruised my hip pretty badly, nothing broken, but I was on the floor for about 20 minutes before I managed to get myself up, because I'd made the mistake of not bringing my phone in with me. I told Brian about it because I didn't want him to hear it from someone else and feel betrayed, and I genuinely believed at the time that being honest with him would build trust rather than tear it down. I was wrong about that. That fall became Exhibit A. Within 2 weeks, he was talking about a family meeting to discuss next steps, and I knew exactly what that meant because I'd watched enough of my own friends go through it. It meant assisted living brochures. It meant a conversation dressed up as concern that was really about control. The family meeting happened on a Sunday in October. Kelly flew in from Arizona for it, which told me Brian had been building his case with her too, coordinating behind my back before I'd even walked in the door. They sat me down at my own kitchen table, the one Donna and I bought secondhand in 1988 that still had a water ring on it from a glass Kelly left there as a teenager, and Brian laid out a plan. Not a suggestion. A plan already assembled, already researched. He'd looked into a facility about 15 minutes from his house, a senior living community with a name like The Meadows at something or other. And he had brochures, actual glossy brochures with photos of smiling gray-haired people doing chair yoga and eating dinner at long communal tables under warm lighting. He talked about liability, about how he couldn't sleep at night worrying about me falling again and no one finding me for hours. He talked about how much easier it would be for everyone if I was somewhere with staff on hand. And then he said the thing that changed everything. He said that he and Kelly had already spoken to an elder law attorney, and that given my recent pattern of concerning decisions, meaning the fall, meaning Susan, meaning a couple of forgotten bills, he thought it would be wise for everyone's protection, including mine, if he had power of attorney. Not someday, not as a contingency plan for the future, now. He'd already scheduled an appointment. He wanted me to come in and sign. I want to be fair here because I've had over a year to sit with this and think about it from every angle, and I don't think Brian is a bad person. I think Brian is a scared person who processes fear by trying to control the things around him, and I think losing his mother the way we lost her, suddenly, with no warning, no chance to say anything, broke something in him that he never properly dealt with. And instead of dealing with it, he redirected all of that fear onto me, onto keeping me safe, onto making sure nothing sudden and uncontrollable ever happened to him again. I understand that. I even have some sympathy for it. But understanding where a thing comes from doesn't make it hurt any less when it's happening to you. I refused to sign anything that day. I told them I appreciated their concern, but that I was of sound mind, that a bruised hip from a shower fall was not evidence of incapacity, and that I wasn't going to hand over control of my own life because my son had gotten scared. Brian didn't take that well. He said, and I remember this almost word for word, because it's the kind of sentence that lodges itself permanently in your chest, "Dad, I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to protect what's left of the family before something happens that we can't fix." As if I were already a problem in progress. As if the version of me sitting right there at my own kitchen table, capable of driving myself to that meeting, capable of running my own household for over 70 years, was already a ghost he was mourning in advance. I told them I needed time to think, and I left that meeting believing foolishly that it was over, that I'd made my position clear, and that would be respected. It was not over. Over the following weeks, Brian's calls got more frequent, and each one had a way of circling back to the same handful of topics: the fall, my finances, Susan, my safety. He started using language I recognized from those elder fraud pamphlets he liked to forward, phrases like diminished capacity and undue influence, and I began to realize with a cold, sinking feeling that he wasn't just worried about me. He was building a case, a paper trail, documenting incidents. I found out later through Kelly, who eventually felt guilty enough to tell me, that Brian had actually gone so far as to ask my primary care doctor, without my knowledge or consent, for an informal assessment of my cognitive state based entirely on second-hand descriptions of the shower fall and the donation to a charity he didn't recognize. My doctor, to her credit, told him she couldn't discuss my health with him without my authorization and that nothing in my chart suggested any cognitive concern whatsoever. Brian did not mention this conversation to me. I only found out because Kelly slipped. That's the moment something shifted in me. Not anger exactly, or not only anger, something closer to clarity. I realized that my son had quietly decided, somewhere in the fog of his own grief and fear, that my remaining years were a liability to be managed rather than a life to be lived, and that he was going to keep pursuing that conclusion with or without my cooperation, because in his mind, he was the responsible one, the one doing the hard, unpleasant work of protecting a father too stubborn to see his own decline. And here's the thing that made it so hard to fight. Every single thing I did to push back got absorbed right back into his narrative. I get defensive, that's a sign of decline. I get calm and reasonable, that's a sign I've been coached, maybe by Susan, maybe by someone else looking to take advantage. There was no version of me that could win, because the story had already been written before I got a vote in it. In January, about 3 months after that kitchen table meeting, Brian filed for a conservatorship review with the county, using the shower fall, the donation, and, I later learned, a wildly exaggerated account of a conversation with a neighbor who'd apparently mentioned to Brian in passing that I'd seemed a little forgetful one afternoon, which, as far as I can tell, referred to me forgetting to bring my recycling bin in 1 week. He didn't get a full conservatorship. The court thankfully wasn't willing to go that far, based on what he presented. But in the course of that process, under pressure from Kelly and from his own attorney, who I think recognized a losing case when he saw one, we ended up in mediation, and out of that mediation came a compromise, if you can call it that. I would voluntarily sign a limited power of attorney, giving Brian oversight of certain financial matters, with the understanding, verbal, not written, that it was a precaution and not a takeover. I signed it because I was exhausted, because the legal fees were mounting on both sides, because Kelly begged me to just make it stop so the family could heal, and because some part of me, I'll admit, was starting to doubt myself the way you inevitably start to doubt yourself when the people who supposedly love you most keep insisting, calmly and repeatedly, that something is wrong with you. I sat in that lawyer's office and I signed the document, and I want to tell you exactly what that felt like, because I think it's the part people skip over when they talk about situations like this. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like watching someone hand you a leash and calling it a hug. Brian actually put his hand on my shoulder afterward and said, "Thank you, Dad. This is going to make things so much easier." Easier for whom? I remember thinking, but I didn't say it out loud. I signed my name, and I drove home, and I sat in my driveway for probably 20 minutes before I could bring myself to go inside, because I understood with total clarity that the man sitting in that car was not going to spend whatever years he had left being managed. I just didn't yet know what I was going to do instead. The answer, strangely enough, came from Susan. Not because she suggested it, but because of something she said almost in passing. She'd mentioned once that her late husband's brother had retired to the Philippines years earlier, some city called Dumaguete, and that he'd sent her photos every Christmas of a life that looked, frankly, better than anything either of us had waiting for us in California. Warm weather, cheap living, a house with a garden he tended himself, a whole community of people who treated him like a fixture of the neighborhood rather than a problem to be scheduled around. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a conversation over coffee. But it stuck somewhere in the back of my mind the way certain small comments do, waiting for the right moment to matter. That moment came about 2 weeks after I signed the power of attorney, on a night I couldn't sleep, lying in a bed that had been half empty for 4 years, running through the whole absurd sequence of events that had gotten me there, a bruised hip and a donation to a veterans charity somehow adding up, in my own son's mind, to grounds for surrendering control of my life. And I asked myself a question I hadn't let myself ask honestly in a long time. If nobody in this family is going to let me be an adult, where could I go where I still would be one? I started researching that same week, quietly, the way I imagine a lot of people research things they're not ready to admit they're seriously considering. I looked up retirement visas. I found the Special Resident Retirees Visa Program, which lets foreign retirees live in the Philippines long-term without renewing a tourist visa every couple of months, provided you meet certain deposit and income requirements, which, between my pension and my Social Security, I comfortably did. I read expat forums late into the night. I watched hours of YouTube videos of retired Americans, some my age, some older, walking through their homes in Cebu and Dumaguete and Manila, showing off apartments that cost less per month than my property tax bill back in Sacramento. I read about the health care, the cost of living, the visa renewal process, the practical mechanics of actually pulling off a move like this at 74 years old with a son who technically had legal oversight of my finances. That last part worried me more than anything else. I went back and reread the power of attorney document line by line, and something Brian's own attorney had insisted on, ironically as a concession to make me feel more comfortable signing it, turned out to be my way out. The document was limited specifically to certain jointly held accounts and did not extend to my personal retirement savings, which I'd kept entirely separate since before Donna even passed, in an account Brian didn't have access to and, as far as I could tell, didn't fully know the balance of. It also did not, critically, extend to my passport, my ability to travel, or my right to make decisions about where I lived. Brian had built his entire case around my finances and my physical safety inside that house. He had never once, in all those months of meetings and lawyers and mediation, considered the possibility that I might simply leave the entire jurisdiction of his concern altogether. I spent about 6 weeks quietly putting things in order. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning, not Brian, not Kelly, not even Susan at first, though she figured it out before I said anything, the way perceptive people do. I sold my car privately to a neighbor's grandson for a fair price, cash, deposited into the account Brian had no access to. I arranged for a property management company to handle the house, deciding I'd rent it out rather than sell it right away, partly because I wasn't 100% certain this was permanent, and partly, I'll be honest, because some part of me still wasn't ready to fully sever the last physical thing Donna and I had built together. I packed one suitcase and one duffel bag. I set up an international health insurance plan specifically designed for expats, the kind that covers evacuation and major procedures, something I made sure to research thoroughly precisely because I knew if this ever came out, what about your health care would be the very first weapon aimed at me. I booked a one-way ticket to Manila for a Thursday in March. I told Brian and Kelly on the Sunday before over the phone, deliberately not in person, because I knew if I did it face-to-face, they would find some way to physically stop the conversation from ending the way I needed it to end. I said, I wanted you both to know that I'm moving to the Philippines. My flight leaves Thursday. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I actually said, hello, to check the call hadn't dropped. Then Brian said, very carefully in the tone of voice you'd use with someone standing near a ledge, Dad, is this a joke? I told him it wasn't. He asked if this was about the power of attorney. I told him it absolutely was about the power of attorney, and about the shower fall being treated like a diagnosis, and about him calling my doctor behind my back, and about the fact that somewhere over the last year and a half, my own children had decided that the appropriate response to my grief was to start quietly taking my life away from me piece by piece under the banner of protecting it. He didn't take that well. He accused me of running away, of being manipulated, ironically enough, by exactly the kind of scam he'd spent 2 years warning me about, except this time the scam was apparently my own decision to leave the country. He said, and this is the line that has stuck with me the longest out of this entire ordeal, you can't just leave, Dad. What happens if something goes wrong and we can't get to you? And I told him the truth, which was that something had already gone wrong, right there in California, in his own attempt to manage me into a smaller and smaller life, and that whatever happened to me next in Manila, I would at least be the one who got to decide what that life looked like. Kelly cried on the phone. Brian went cold and formal, told me he thought I was making a serious mistake, and asked whether I'd at least consulted my doctor before making such a drastic decision, which, given the history of him consulting my doctor without my consent, struck me as almost darkly funny. I flew out that Thursday. Nobody came to the airport. I sat alone at the gate in Sacramento with my duffel bag between my feet, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not fear, and not even really sadness, but a kind of enormous aching relief. The specific relief of a man who has just set down something heavy he's been carrying without realizing how much it was bending his spine. The flight to Manila with a layover in Seoul took close to 18 hours all told. I'm not a young man, and I'll admit that flight nearly broke me physically, my knees swollen, my back stiff, unable to really sleep in coach for more than an hour at a stretch. But somewhere over the Pacific, staring at a little animated plane crawling across a map on the seatback screen, I thought about Brian's voice on that phone call. What happens if something goes wrong and we can't get to you? And I realized that question had haunted my entire final year in California. In a way, it wasn't haunting me anymore. 11,000 meters over the ocean, heading somewhere entirely of my own choosing. I landed at Ninoy Aquino International Airport on a Friday evening, and the heat hit me the second the doors slid open, thick and wet and completely unlike anything Sacramento ever produces, even in August. I'd arranged through an online relocation service that specifically caters to retirees for a driver to meet me, a young man named Ferdinand, who held up a sign with my name spelled correctly, a small thing that somehow moved me more than it should have. He loaded my 2 bags into his van and asked, in easy, friendly English, whether this was my first time in the Philippines. I told him it was my first time anywhere outside the United States, except for a single work trip to Canada 30 years earlier, and he laughed and said, "Then welcome to a much bigger world, sir." I'd chosen, after weeks of research, to settle first in Dumaguete, the same city Susan had mentioned all those months ago. a smaller university city on the island of Negros, known among expats as being quieter and more manageable than Manila or Cebu, with a large enough retiree community that I wouldn't be starting entirely from scratch, but small enough that it wouldn't swallow me the way I feared a bigger city might. Getting there meant a domestic flight the next morning from Manila, another hour and a half in the air on top of everything else, and by the time I finally checked into a small service department near the seafront boulevard, called the Rizal Boulevard, I'd been traveling for almost 30 hours straight, and I collapsed onto the bed without even unpacking. I woke up the next morning to the sound of roosters, actual roosters, somewhere in the neighborhood, and the smell of something cooking that I couldn't identify. And I lay there in a bed in a country I had never set foot in before, in a life I had built entirely by myself over 6 secretive weeks. And I felt, for the first time in over a year, like nobody in the world was currently sitting somewhere building a case against me. I want to be honest about the first month, because I don't think it does anyone any favors to pretend it was all sunlight and revelation. It was hard. It was disorienting in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, even after all my research. I didn't know how the local transportation worked, these open-sided jeepneys and tricycles that seemed to follow rules I couldn't decode, some unspoken system everyone else seemed to understand instinctively. I got overcharged at a market my first week because I clearly didn't know what things were supposed to cost, and I only found out because a woman running a nearby stall, an older lady named Nena, pulled me aside afterward and told me, not unkindly, that I'd paid triple what a local would pay. And from that day forward, she made a point of waving me specifically to her own stall whenever she saw me coming, telling me flatly what a fair price was before I could even ask. I rented a small house about a 15-minute tricycle ride from the boulevard in a quiet residential area called Piapi, a 2-bedroom place with a little concrete yard where I could sit outside in the mornings for 11,000 pesos a month, which comes out to somewhere around $200, a figure that when I first calculated it, I actually said out loud to an empty room, because it seemed impossible that a house, an entire house, could cost less than what I used to pay for cable and internet back in Sacramento. If any part of this sounded familiar to you, if you've got a family member who started treating your independence like a problem to be managed rather than a life to be respected, I hope this gave you something to hold on to. And if you want more stories like this one, real people making real, sometimes difficult, sometimes messy decisions to actually live the years they've got left, instead of just protecting them, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and stick around, because there are a lot more of these coming, and I think you're going to want to hear them. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.